Hi, Kristie. Thanks for joining me today and agreeing to talk about your work.
You're very welcome.
I
Thanks for
love
having me.
seeing everything behind you is so wonderful.
Thanks.
Um,
This interview inspired me to make a little gallery wall.
yeah,
So
yeah, absolutely.
you're the first to see it.
Yeah, yeah. So as you know, I'm new to CCA, and so I'm being introduced to a lot of folks and their work that I wasn't previously aware of, and this show in particular has been really wonderful to get to know some people in the community. And because of that, I think probably a lot of people would also like to hear kind of what your background is, how you got into fiber art and weaving in particular, and if you want to kind of just give us your
Yeah,
story, that would be wonderful.
it's kind of a it's kind of a crazy story, and I'll try to keep it short. But when I graduated from undergrad, I went to Whitman in Washington State, and I became a high school English teacher.
Mm.
And I taught school for 3 years, absolutely loved it, thought it was great, and then wanted to go back and get my master's. So, kind of as a sidebar to that, I'd always been really interested in textiles, and they'd always been that sort of like hobby, that thing that I did on the side. And I had actually bought a little loom and taught myself to weave, and I took weaving classes in continuing education and things like that, but I'd never pursued it beyond that. My master's thesis was supposed to be tracking the superstitions of people that live on small coastal islands off the shores of larger islands. So I was traveling around, I was circumnavigating Ireland and going to all these little tiny islands that are off the coast of Ireland. And I eventually went up to the Orkney and Shetland Islands. But when I was in Ireland, and this was in the 70s, I just, it was back in the day. I mean, I was hitchhiking by myself. I came upon all this cottage industry weaving where, I'd be walking down a road and I'd hear this clack, 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 and all of a sudden I'd come to this building where, I mean, hopelessly picturesque, maybe some lady was sitting outside spinning on a spinning wheel. And inside were these small weaving facilities with maybe, 3 looms, maybe 5 looms. And I was blown away by it and seeing what they were making. So I ended up packing up all my research that I had done and sending it home to my mother. Keep in mind, this is before, long before email and things like that. I mean, she had to wait to get a letter from me to hear what was going on. But anyway, I ended up traveling for almost a year looking at textile techniques. I traveled all around, the perimeter of Europe, and then I went down through Greece and what at the time was Yugoslavia. I went across Turkey. I went to Iran. I ended up living in a carpet weaving village for a couple of weeks. And when I came back, there was a huge movement of textiles as an art form that kind of had one of the epicenters for that movement was in Berkeley, in the Bay Area, not just Berkeley. And so I ended up going down there and going to school. There were all these incredible schools. There was, of course, what was called then California College for the Arts and Crafts.
Right.
But there was a school called Fiberworks that was run by this incredibly creative weaver who is still working. The Young Art Museum had a fabulous program, and I took a couple of really amazing classes there with a woman. You'll be interested in this, Carolyn, because I saw that you went to Cranbrook. She was a Cranbrook student.
Oh, cool.
So that is where I got my kind of technical background for weaving. I moved back to Seattle, where I'm originally from, and tried to make it as a weaver, tried to support myself as a weaver, which wasn't terribly successful. And I migrated just kind of by happenstance into the interior design profession, related to the interior design profession, textiles for interiors. And to really condense that, I ended up, a company called Knoll International put an ad in the Seattle Times that said, if you know about textiles and are organized, call us. So I got that job, and that was the beginning of my career in professional textiles. I ended up moving to New York, becoming the design director for a group of 5 Canadian textile mills. And these were mills that were weaving commercial quality fabrics for homes and offices.
Right.
And that is what my professional career was in all those years. I established myself as a colorist, and I did design and color work for a huge variety of companies over the 35 years that I lived in New York. And then I guess it was the last Christmas that I was in New York, or maybe the second to the last Christmas. I have a group of friends that we always celebrate Christmas together with our kids. And we always try to have some activity, keeping in mind our kids are all now grown up. And she brought potholder looms. So we all had our own potholder looms. And we were all sitting around, madly making potholders. And I can't explain it, but I was just overcome with this absolute need. It wasn't even a desire. It was like this need to weave. And because when I moved to New York, I didn't bring my loom. Who has room for a loom in a New York apartment, and I really left my weaving behind. And I didn't feel like I missed it terribly until that moment. I had such a terrific time throughout my career, which thankfully is still active. But at any rate, from the potholder loom, I ended up buying a little frame loom, which I still use. And then I got the idea that I really wanted to start weaving again seriously. And doing that in New York just seemed impossible because of how expensive New York is. I had a wonderful apartment. It didn't really have room for a loom without just kind of taking over the whole space. I had a fabulous studio space where I carried on my professional work, but it was expensive, and I couldn't generate. I just didn't see how I could make all the pieces fit together. So, as I mentioned early on, I went to Whitman. I grew up in Washington. My best friend lives in our little nearby community, Trout Lake, and I'd been coming out here for years to see her, bringing my kids. And so I started looking at real estate out here, and here I am in White Salmon. 3 years later, I still have a couple of clients that I do work for. I'm the design director for a big company called Edelman Leather. I do all the color work and the design work for them. But I have time to weave, and I can afford to live, and I'm very happy.
Yeah.
So that's kind of it's a long story, but it was an interesting path.
I know I asked you this question at the opening, but it was so amazing. I think it was kind of hard actually. I'm really interested in the process of weaving as a time physical process, particularly people who have a bit here at CCA, the way it relates to photography for you, and what that really is between imagery
You're kind of breaking up, Carolyn. I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding you.
Yeah.
Can you pose that again, like a kind of a short version?
So, just thinking about the process of weaving,
Mm-hmm.
and how fiber art is very tactile way of working and time consuming. You're making a thing on there, and thinking about the work that you have here at play. And I'm really interested in that relationship between photography that you're making imagery of and the physical act.
Okay, that was kind of hard to understand, but I think you were asking about, the use of texture and fibers and how those come together, and it's one of those things that's difficult to explain, but I've always had a thing about yarn. And while I do knit, my passion has been weaving from an early age. And because of my professional career as a colorist, over the years, I've become more and more enamored with the way, colors, the effect that colors have on us. And the pieces that I have right now in the gallery, there are 10 of them that are all blue and white because they're these kind of topographical maps of water. And there I was really able to play with the texture, which I really love. And I think in my professional career, the way you create texture on a commercial industrial loom is quite different than what the possibilities are with a hand loom. And I also love, different natural fibers. My work is usually wool. I don't work really with any synthetics at all. I do love linen, and I have an idea for a series of linen pieces that I want to do.
Beautiful. So I'm gonna I think I can ask you the question, so I'll ask Lily, but I'll type it.
Okay, good. Yeah, because that was, I don't know why, because you were clear as could be at the beginning.
It's just Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Great. Let's see. So I think another interesting thing about your work is the scale. You tend to, it seems, work a little bit smaller, and it definitely relates to the body in a different way. Sometimes when we think about fiber, we think about, blankets or things that are functional, and you're kind of making these pieces that are more of a composition.
Right.
You can just kind of talk about scale and how that plays a role in your work.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I love that you asked it. When I first started weaving, again, in my second round of weaving, at first I was just doing it for myself, and then I thought, all right, well, I love this, and I can't, keep weaving just for myself. And if I want to sell things, what would people buy? And that whole internal conversation that we have. And one of the things I started thinking about, okay, people are always interested in things they can use, which kind of migrates out of what we would classically call art.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I do where I get to indulge my passion for texture, color, yarn, weaving, is that I make pillows.
Mm-hmm.
I make these beautiful pillows. I should have brought one with me to hold up, but at any rate, then when I started doing I call them the little weavings, one of the things I realized, and Carolyn, you having worked in a gallery, I'm sure you've experienced this, that when people buy art of any sort, an individual can come in who, lives alone, and they can select something they love and they can buy it, and they don't have to get anybody else's buy-in on it. It's like it strikes them, they love it, and they write the check. But many times art has to be vetted by more than one person. Like if you're married and you have a strong opinion, I was married for years to an architect, and while we had really similar taste in a lot of things, we would really lock horns on, what we were going to spend money on in the way of art. And I was and still am still into the serigraphs, the Inuit serigraphs that are produced, in the Arctic Circle by the native Inuit people. And I have a beautiful collection of those. And, my ex-husband at first didn't appreciate that, although by the time we got divorced, he wanted half of them, and now he puts them on his own. So, but anyway, my thought with the little weavings was that they don't require buy-in from, the whole component. It can be, because they can go anywhere. I make some that are small enough to fit in the wall space, like maybe between two doors, or they look really wonderful in a gallery setting with other pieces of art. They're fun to mix in with, paintings or drawings or, all the kinds of things that people love and collect. So while I absolutely will make bigger pieces, and I've had people say, oh, I wish your pieces were bigger. And I always say, I'll make you a bigger piece. But I feel like there's a certain speculative nature to making something like this that I feel like when they're small, like they look great in the back of a bookcase. They're intended as a little bit of joy and a spark of color and just a little bit of personality, someplace. And so that's why I do tend to work in this smaller scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially looking at the pieces behind you and knowing that you have this background as a colorist, I started thinking about, like, some of these even remind me a little bit of Agnes Martin's work. And I'm wondering, in terms of your influences, both artistically and maybe more kind of in the craft history, who and what you're most interested in, and people that you look at.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Agnes Martin, because she is an artist whose work I love. And in fact, I had the opportunity to work on a textile collection, a commercially woven textile collection, when I was doing work for a company called Design Tex. And they did a number of fabrics that were inspired by her, through her estate. So it was all totally on the up and up. And I do think, kind of along with yarn and fiber, I've always loved systems of color. I love paint chip books. I love Pantone books. I love, all of those things. I can spend, a lot of time in a really good stationery store. Like, I've found these fabulous stationery stores in various cities I go to, and I love European stationery office supply stores. And so I think that, along with a lot of, reading, more technical reading about the effect of color on us, but because of my background of studying weaving, and because of the work that I've done in the interiors industry, I have to say, and my first really serious job working at Knoll International, I am totally influenced by the Bauhaus. And
okay,
that whole period of time just really, really has a huge sway with me. And there were so many artists, like I look at people that do, like, I look at Paul Klee, for instance, and the little geometric color studies that he did. But one of the really cool things that I got to work on in my professional life was I was doing a ton of work for this Austrian mill that had been around for well over 100 years and had, made it through the First and Second World War. And they held the archive for the Wiener Werkstatt, which was, this incredible group of people that were working together very similarly to the Bauhaus movement. And so I'm drawing a blank right now on the names of some of those artists, but their work was all about color and geometry. So even though I have done, and I do many things, like I'm onto maps right now, and I'm really fascinated with that. I feel like I love geometry and the play of color. So
yeah, absolutely. That is, it definitely comes out in
yeah.
Let's see. Just trying to think some of the things you talked about. When you were talking about circumnavigating Ireland, was that by boat?
No, I was hitchhiking.
Okay.
And I would go up the coast. Like, I was mostly on the western and the northern coast of Ireland. And actually, I just finished reading an incredible book called Say Nothing, which was about the Irish resistance movement in the 70s. And I knew that I had to be careful when I was in Northern Ireland, and I was in what is referred to as Derry. I mean, now it was Londonderry then.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read this book, I realized that I was right in the middle of it, right at the time that some pretty scary stuff was happening. But, it's the old story. I was like this hitchhiker kind of going along. Nothing bad happened. It was all good. I had a fabulous time in Ireland. And, I met so many cool, interesting people. And the same thing when I went over to Scotland. And I ended up going all the way up to the northern tip of Scotland, and then up to the Orkney Islands and the Shetland Islands, which are really up there and out there. And, they all, and that's what's so fascinating to me about textiles, and I think why I love them so much, is that there are fabulous textiles the world over in every possible climate. You associate wool with colder climates and people raising sheep, but then you get into the hot climates and you have silk and you have cotton, and you go to Indonesia, their textile heritage is phenomenal. So I love the history of textiles, and the fact that in the history of man, it wasn't all that long ago that every single solitary piece of clothing that we wore was hand woven by somebody, and with mechanization, all that changed. But I just love the process, and the simplicity of it. It's very zen. And in these rough times that we've been going through between the pandemic and then this phenomenal, upswell of social, just a cry out for social justice for everyone. Weaving is a very nice place to retreat into from time to time, just to get calm. And I listen to books. I don't usually just weave. I usually listen to a book. But
I'm a big podcaster when I'm working, and audiobooks. It's definitely the news, and it definitely starts infiltrating the work.
It does. It really does. And you realize you feel kind of anxious, and you think, I have nothing to feel anxious about, frankly. I live a very privileged life. I live in a wonderful location. But you realize that, you're experiencing this turmoil virtually, and it's having an effect because it's all stuff that I care about deeply. And so anyway.
So thinking about your work in relationship to the other artists in the show, and knowing that you all had conversation as you were putting the show together, I'm just wondering what your relationship to water is. You have this beautiful series in the space that is all, aerial topography of water, and I'm just wondering if you can elaborate about that work a little more.
That's another really good question, because I was actually born in Spokane, Washington, which is on the east side of Washington State, and moved at a young age, like I think I was in third grade, to Olympia, right on Sound. And one of the little weavings in the Oceans and Seas series is called Butler Cove, and it's the cove that I actually grew up on in Olympia. And when we moved to Olympia, my mom always told the story that my parents were trying to buy this house that was on the water, out on the bay, as it's referred to in Olympia. And it was really a beautiful house. It was designed by an architect and for his own use, and they were selling it. And it had a drop-dead view of Butler Cove. And my mom always said, when my dad walked in the door of that house and saw that view, it was all over. He was going to figure out how we could buy that house, which I think was probably out of their budget.
Right.
So I grew up with that. And I've had friends say to me, do you realize that everywhere you live, you always have an amazing view? And I realized that it's true, that something in me, and I think it was in my dad as well, I really need to be near water. And even when I lived in New York, for the majority of time that I lived in New York, I lived on 14th Street between 5th and University, which we used to joke is the epicenter of the universe. And I lived on the top of the building, so I had a spectacular view, north and south, like World Trade Center on one side and the Empire State Building on the other. But I could also see the East River, and I could see the Hudson River. And I moved to Brooklyn the last 6 years that I was in New York. And I lived right on the Brooklyn Promenade, looking back at New York with an amazing view. And even when I lived in Seattle, I had an apartment above Lake Union that was incredibly noisy, but it had a spectacular view of the lake. So there's something, a connection with water, and all of the pieces that I did in Oceans and Seas. I said in my statement that they were idiosyncratic to me. They are places like the Pacific Ocean. I have so many good memories about that. Then I lived for so many years on the Atlantic Ocean. I have really good friends who live in Turkey. I've spent a lot of time with them, and I'm just fascinated. They can have a really amazing view of the Bosphorus from their house, and that whole idea of a body of water separating continents, such a narrow, small body of water separating continents. So I got this idea that it would be fun to kind of try to interpret these in a very abstract way. I have a good friend who lives on the coast of Maine, right on the ocean. And I did one that's called Round Pond. And then there's a beach on Long Island called Flying Point that I used to go to with friends and take my girls. So all of those places resonate with me. And now I have a really beautiful view of the Columbia River. So, which I'm hoping never to leave.
I hear you on that one. I have a really nice view now. And
you do. I saw your Instagram. You're up there in the high prairie.
Yeah.
Those skies are unbelievable.
A little bit from there. Yeah. So one last question. What do you love about CCA?
What I love about the CCA are the possibilities. I love the idea that, first of all, I think it's an amazing space. The fact that not only is there the gallery space, which we proved on this show alone how flexible it can be in terms of reorganizing for different kinds of shows. But the fact that the center also has a classroom that is really amazing and a theater. And I just feel like it has so much potential, and that we as artists and the community that care about arts and care about our community, that we have to really work to take full advantage of what the center has to offer, which I think Lee, the new director, I think that's her mission. I think that's what you guys are trying to do. But just being invited to be part of the show, for me, it was a huge honor to be included with, these very impressive women who have been practicing their art their whole lives. It's like what they do. And I feel like I've kind of come back to this late in the game, and getting to know them better and to see their work and see how beautifully our work came together in that show. None of us knew what anyone else was doing until the very end, when we started sharing photos with you, so you could. And it was kind of like, oh my God, the show is going to look so fantastic. And a friend of mine who's the director of the Dells Art Center, Scott Stevenson, said when he was standing in the gallery kind of surveying the whole room, he just said, the color palette for this show is what really pulls it together. And it's just amazing how, some of the bright colors in Sorka's paintings, how they connected with the colors in some of my weavings, and then the blues that in Jane's gorgeous monotypes with, Michelle's much more exuberant underwater things. It was so beautiful.
Yeah. I've been very lucky to sit in here every day and spend time with that.
Yeah, I would like to be able to sit in
there. The way
there.
you all opened up the space feels so good.
Yeah. And, it's great. I've told a few people who, I invited, and they're going, oh, I don't know. And I said, listen, there is nothing dangerous or threatening. The space is wide open.
Right.
It's just not an issue. People wear masks and you come in. It's never going to be super crowded. So it's just not an issue at all. And it's an opportunity
to visit right now, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. I love your background with Jane's beautiful. Yeah, it's nice. It's really, really nice.
Wonderful.
So I have great hope for getting the word out more, and making the art community on the Washington side of the river be supportive of Columbia Center for the Arts, because we have a great arts council in White Salmon, but we don't have a building that we have one teeny tiny little gallery, which is lovely, and that's it. And so I think being able to drive across the river and see a show like this is really exciting, and especially in these times,
Absolutely.
It's really
nice
to go and just be kind of carried away by something beautiful and thought-provoking, because all of the work in that show is extremely thoughtful. A lot of thought went into the imagery, the symbolism. Listening to Sorka talk about her work, really just like inspiring.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to stop recording so we can chat separately, but thanks for doing the interview. We're going to be putting it on the site for everyone to enjoy and learn more about you.
Now they know almost everything.
I don't think so.